All right. Chapter 9 continues the saga of Gideon's family. And we saw in chapter 8, Gideon has finally defeated the Midianites. He is now dead, but he's left himself somewhat of a posterity. Gideon's sons are grown, but a nation is turned back to idolatry. And then there's a half-brother in the mix that is hell-bent on doing anything it takes in order to come into power. Now, when you first read this plot, it almost sounds like a movie straight out of Hollywood. But I assure you that what we read here in Scripture is very, very real. Chapter 9 begins the brief rule of Abimelech, who is Gideon's son and the half-brother of the rest of Gideon's sons. He's a man that wastes no time in trying to achieve what he feels like is rightfully his, namely the kingship. And it's interesting to look at Abimelech's character and to kind of see how that matches with his name. His name means, my father is king. This is yet further proof that Gideon did indeed try to establish a monarchy against God's will. And we looked at that last week towards the end, and we said that even though the author never specifically stated that Gideon was trying to establish a monarchy, yet in the latter half of chapter 8, we see that Gideon lives the lifestyle of a king by amassing many wives and amassing a little bit of wealth for himself. And to further top that off, he names his son from a concubine, my father is king. So apparently Gideon thought of himself as a king. So looking at the story here, we see something in Abimelech that far exceeds what a ruler should be like. We see somebody who is really, when you get down right to it, is just pure evil. We read the story and we look at the tragedy of some of Abimelech's actions. And oftentimes people will look at this and compare these kind of stories in the Bible to things that are going on today. Now, I don't know if we can compare Abimelech to any of the evil people that we see ruling today, but one thing is for certain, that no matter what happened in Abimelech's reign, no matter what happens in our reign, the one thing we always see is that God is in complete control of every situation. Did God knew what Abimelech would do before Abimelech did it? Absolutely. If we are to look at the Scriptures and believe that God is a sovereign God and sovereign over every single action, then we have to believe that God not only knew that Abimelech was going to do what he did, but he was the one to raise Abimelech up, to put him in that position. The first 6 verses of chapter 9 really cover the plot of Abimelech, while the rest of the chapter deals with kind of the ensuing consequences and the succeeding consequences of Abimelech's actions. This morning we're just going to deal only with the first 6 verses that cover Abimelech's plot and that cover the things that he did. And we're going to look at the topic of what happens when God allows evil men to reign. What is God's purpose in allowing somebody evil to come up and to reign over a people, and especially his own people? So we're just going to walk through the first 6 verses, and then we're going to take what we learned from these 6 verses and make an application for us today here. But beginning at verse 1, we see at the very opening that Abimelech is traveling to his mother's relatives and to his mother at Shechem. Now, just as a side note, I think it's important to understand what Shechem is. Shechem was not some small, out-of-the-way hick town in Israel. Shechem was actually quite an affluent city. For example, it was one of the towns given to the Levites as a city of refuge back in Joshua 21:21. Joshua 21:21, of course, the Israelites have come into the land, and they've begun to conquer, and Joshua has started giving out the inheritance. Now, if you remember, the Levites did not receive a permanent inheritance in the land because God said that the Levites would be or that he would be the Levites' portion. Therefore, they would not receive a permanent inheritance. And because of that, each of the tribes of Israel had to give a piece of land for the Levites to live on for their service to God. Shechem was one of those cities. Joshua 21:21 says, "To them, the Levites, were given Shechem, the city of refuge for the manslayer, with its pasture lands in the hill country of Ephraim, Gezer, and with its pasture lands." Now, Joshua here refers to a city of refuge. What was the city of refuge? Well, when Joshua divided up the land, he designated 6 different cities, 3 on the east side of the Jordan, 3 on the west side of Jordan. They were all Levitical cities, and they were titled cities of refuge. Now, what a city of refuge was where a person who accidentally killed somebody could flee to escape what was called the Avenger of Blood. And the Avenger of Blood was, well, the one who avenged the blood of his relative that was killed. Now, in order for this to take place, it couldn't be an intentional murder. It had to be something that was not premeditated. It had to be something that was totally accidental. It had to be something that the person did not do out of malice. For an example, of course, back in those days, the tools that they used were actually kind of crude, and oftentimes they would have a piece of iron just on a stick as an axe. Chopping down a tree, an axe head might fly off and hit somebody and kill them. Well, according to the law, the person who accidentally killed another person was able to flee to the nearest city of refuge. And the law protected that person from being killed by the Avenger of Blood. And as long as that person was in that city and did not go out of the city limits, the Avenger of Blood would not be able to rightfully go in and avenge the blood of his relatives. However, if that person decided to leave the city boundaries, God made provisions for the Avenger of Blood and said, hey, that guy's blood is on his own head. Another requirement was that the person who fled to a city of refuge would have to stay in that city until the appointed high priest's death. If he left that city any time before the high priest died and a new one was appointed, then his blood would be on his own head if the person caught up with him, if the Avenger of Blood caught up with that person. Now, I give you all this information to say this. When Abimelech went to Shechem, yes, his relatives lived there, but he knew exactly where to go in order to begin to conceive and give birth to the plot that he was about to do. As I said before, Shechem was not some out-of-the-way hick town. It was a town that was well known. Not only was it a city of refuge, it was also the place where Joshua reinstated the covenant shortly before his death in Joshua 24. This is where Joshua gives his great speech where he says, as for you serve who you want to serve, as for me and my house we shall serve the Lord. This was taking place at Shechem, renewing the covenant between Israel and Yahweh. And more so, Shechem was also the place where the borders of Ephraim and Manasseh met. Now, Manasseh and Ephraim were considered one tribe. They were both considered half-tribes. They were the tribe of Joseph. But because Joseph was obviously the leader of Israel, Egypt at that time, he died. His sons were the ones to represent his offspring. And it's also interesting, if you remember back in chapter 8, when Gideon finished the battle, pretty much, he had almost won the battle. The kings had fled. Where did they flee to? They fled to the hill country of Ephraim. And if you remember, Gideon sent messengers into the hill country of Ephraim to bring the heads of the kings to him, and they did. And if you remember, Gideon had a quarrel with the men of Ephraim. The men of Ephraim were upset that they had not called him earlier to help with the battle. Now, whether Abimelech knew this information or not, we don't know. But I do know that his relatives living in Shechem and him going to Shechem, he knew where he was going and he knew where to go in order to conceive his plot. Now, it was previously discovered about Abimelech that he was the son of a concubine rather than a legitimate child. Now, back then in that culture, concubines were actually quite often. A concubine was a woman who was kind of a, I guess you could say, kind of a side woman for the husband, but in a legitimate way. And I use that word loosely in quotes. We see several testimonies from Scripture that God had intended marriage to be a monogamous union. Now, oftentimes concubines were used to bear children for those who were barren, for the women who were barren. We see this, first of all, with Abraham and Hagar. And if you remember, God promised Abraham at the age of 75 that he would have a son. And years went by, and Abraham and Sarah had not yet conceived. And Sarah, becoming distraught, gives her slave Hagar into Abraham's hands and says, "Here, have her bear children for me." Now, in a case like that, the children would actually be considered the children not of the concubine, but the children of the actual wife. We see the same exact thing with Jacob and Rachel. And you remember, because the Bible tells us that because Leah was unloved and Rachel was loved, that God closed up Rachel's womb and opened Leah's womb. Therefore, Rachel was barren and couldn't have children, so what did Rachel do? She takes her maidservant and gives her to Jacob and says, "Have children for me." So oftentimes a concubine was used to have children in order to pass the inheritance along. But for the most part, a concubine was just somebody that was kind of on the side to gratify the husband's desires. The law made, later on, the law made provisions for concubines in certain ways. For example, a concubine couldn't just be taken and then sold to another person. The law protected the concubine in that. But as a result of the male and the concubine relationship, obviously children would be born. Now, even though they were not considered the children of the actual wife, they were still usurped and became an integral part of the family. They became people who assumed responsibilities. We see, again, Jacob's sons who were born of maidservants. We see them taking part in the family by providing food and working the fields and attending the flock. And they were considered children of in a sense, but when it came to the inheritance, they were not included. They were not included at all. And again, we see an example of this from Genesis chapter 21 and verse 10. And if you remember, at this time, Isaac had been born. God had finally fulfilled His promise to Abraham and Sarah and had given them a son. And at the time when Isaac was coming to age, they were having a sorts of a party for him. And Sarah notices that that Ishmael is kind of prodding and poking and teasing Isaac. And so she gets upset. And her response to Abraham is this: "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." And basically, what she is telling Abraham is, I have my own child. I don't need Ishmael. Ishmael is not to be the inheritance. Isaac is to receive the inheritance. You see, in that culture, the inheritance was passed down from father to son. And the firstborn son would receive a double portion. And after the firstborn son received the double portion, the rest would be divided up between the other children. And if you happen to be a